The hardest fight of his life. The story of Frank McCarthy's life-altering accident and his legendary comeback. It was a November night like any other, a routine end to a long day. Frank had just finished work and met up with his best friend Ray at his place of employment for a ride home that night. But their ride was late, and the last bus of the night wouldn't wait. They decided to walk. The city lights flickered in the distance as they made their way toward the bus stop, the cold night air biting at their skin. They were about to graduate from high school and were talking about what they were going to do for careers as they walked and talked. When they reached the overpass, a route Frank had never taken before, fate made a choice for them. As they were crossing over the overpass, they got about halfway when they see a set of headlights. A familiar car. It was their ride. It all happened in a heartbeat. Without thinking, they basically jaywalked across the overpass in a hurry. The overpass was usually empty, and in that split second, Frank's competitive nature took over. He surged ahead of Ray, determined to reach the center divider before Ray did. He leaped onto the short concrete barrier, his heart pounding with the thrill of the race. But the moment his foot came down, the world beneath him vanished. There was nothing. The realization hit him in an instant. His stomach dropped, his mind screamed, but it was too late. Frank was falling. 50 feet to the cement below. Ray's scream echoed in the night, a desperate, helpless cry. But Frank was already gone, swallowed by the darkness below. Then, impact. Silence. For a moment, everything was black. Then came the pain. Frank regained consciousness after slamming into the ground. A searing, unimaginable pain that tore through Frank's body like fire. It was everywhere, radiating from his head, surging through his limbs, except, he couldn't feel his legs. A groan escaped his lips as his hand weakly reached for the back of his head, where the worst of the pain seemed to be. But then, he realized, it wasn't just his head. It was everything. His entire body was broken. A man appeared out of nowhere, his voice urgent but calm. "Don't move. I'm a doctor." Frank barely registered the words. It felt surreal, like he had been thrown into some cruel movie. None of this could be real. Then he saw him. Ray. His best friend was sprinting toward him, his face streaked with panic and tears. He collapsed beside Frank, hands shaking as he wiped the blood from Frank's face. "I wish it was me," Ray whispered, his voice cracking. Frank managed a weak, pained smile. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't think you can handle this pain." Ray shook his head, helpless, watching as his best friend drifted in and out of consciousness. Frank tried to move. He tried to stand. His body didn't respond. His legs, they weren't working. The pain swallowed him whole again. He faded in and out, the world spinning in agony. The minutes stretched into an eternity until, finally, flashing red lights painted the night. The paramedics arrived. Frank begged them for something, anything, to take the pain away. He pleaded, cursed, screamed for relief. But they could do nothing. He was going straight into emergency surgery. The ambulance ride felt endless. Voices surrounded him, asking questions, trying to keep him awake. But Frank didn't care. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to think. He just wanted the suffering to stop. Then, he felt it. The slow dimming of everything around him. He was dying. The weight of it settled over him like a heavy blanket. His body was shutting down, the pain fading into something more distant, more final. With what little strength he had left, he reached out. "Ray. Ray. Where's Ray?" His voice was faint, desperate. He found his best friend's hand, gripping it weakly. "Goodbye, bro." Tears welled in Ray's eyes. "Don't say that," he begged. Frank's breathing slowed. His grip loosened. His voice barely made it past his lips. "I can't hold on any longer." Then, the doctors took him. As they rushed him into surgery, he felt the cold steel of scissors slicing through his jeans, his favorite 501s. Rage flickered through the haze of pain. "What the hell are you doing?" Frank asked the nurses. "We need to prep you for surgery." Then, they reached for his Adidas jacket. Not that. If this was it, if this was how he went, he would not go without it. His voice was weak, but firm. "Unzip it. Take it off." The nurses hesitated, then did as he asked. And then just like that, the lights went out. The situation was grim. Frank's body lay motionless on the operating table as a team of exhausted surgeons fought to keep him alive. They had just finished a grueling 12-hour surgery, only to turn around and work on him for another 13 hours. Every moment was critical. Every second could be his last. Outside the hospital, the world moved in a whirlwind of panic and confusion. Frank's friends, who had been coming to pick him and Ray up that night, had seen the flashing ambulance lights but didn't yet know what had happened. A terrible feeling settled in their stomachs. They rushed to Frank's brother's house. "Did Frank make it home?" they asked, their voices laced with worry. His brother, Rocky, shook his head. "Not yet." Then, the phone rang. A call no one ever wants to receive. A hospital official informed Rocky that his younger brother had been in a severe accident. His presence was required immediately. The words hit like a hammer to the chest. Rocky didn't hesitate. He and his best friend, Johnny, jumped onto their motorcycles and raced through the night, engines roaring, cutting through traffic like their lives depended on it, because Frank's did. Inside the hospital, the night stretched into eternity. Doctors came out several times during the surgery, their expressions grim, their voices heavy. "It doesn't look good," they admitted to the waiting family. "We're doing everything we can, but he may not survive." The weight of those words crushed the room. Loved ones gripped each other, whispering prayers, pleading with the universe to let Frank pull through. The waiting room filled wall to wall with family and friends. No one wanted to leave. No one could. They had to know, was he going to make it? Then, after hours upon hours of agony, the doors opened. A doctor stepped forward, his face softer now, the tension slightly eased. "He made it," he announced. "Frank has survived." A collective breath filled the room, a mixture of relief and disbelief. Tears fell. Hugs were exchanged. But it wasn't over. Frank was being moved to intensive care, where the battle for his life would continue. As they wheeled him from the operating room, his body fragile, his consciousness flickering in and out, Rocky never left his side. "You're gonna be okay," his brother whispered. "I've got you. I'll take care of you." For Frank, the world was a blur. Now in intensive care. Frank could barely open his eyes, barely register the faces around him. He knew he was in intensive care, where only immediate family was allowed. But that wasn't stopping his friends. They were demanding to see him. The doctors hesitated. This wasn't protocol. But this wasn't just any patient. This was Frank, and his people weren't taking no for an answer. Through cracked lips, Frank managed to rasp, "If I were you, I'd let them in." The doctors gave in. One by one, his friends entered, standing around his broken body, trying their best to hold it together. But when his cousin leaned over him, sobbing, begging him not to die, Frank couldn't help himself. "If I do die, bury me in Adidas. And put some turntables in my grave so I can play music on the other side." She blinked, stunned. Then, laughter through the tears. Even on death's doorstep, Frank was still Frank. One by one, his friends visited, whispered words of love, and left without incident. Everything else was a haze. The pain, the exhaustion, the lingering confusion. It all blurred together, until finally, they moved him to a real hospital room to begin the long road to healing. That was when the truth finally caught up to him. The unthinkable reality. The doctors came in, faces solemn. Frank braced himself. His neurosurgeon stepped forward. "You broke 3 parts of your back," the doctor explained. "Shards of bone lodged into your spinal cord." Frank's pulse quickened. Then, the words that shattered his world. "You'll never walk again." Silence. Frank stared at them, unblinking. He should have felt something. Anger. Fear. Grief. But all he felt was numb. It hadn't fully sunk in. His body refused to accept it. All he knew in that moment was that his legs weren't working. And he was stuck in this moment while real life moved on without him. The days blurred together. Frank didn't know what day it was. He didn't know if it was morning or night. He simply existed. Trapped in bed. Trapped in his own mind. Trapped in a reality he hadn't yet come to terms with. If ever there was a time he needed his mother, this was it. But she had been gone since he was 11 years old. And now, more than anything, he just wanted her arms around him, telling him everything would be okay. But no one could do that. Then, One night after visiting hours, he got a call from the information desk. "Your father is here," they said. Visiting hours were over, but they were making an exception. As he waited for his father, who he hadn't seen in years, to step through the door, someone else walked in. Mr. Raffaello, their high school dean, holding a pizza. Frank blinked in disbelief. "I know you hate hospital food," Mr. Raffaello said with a smirk, setting the pizza down. "So I used that excuse to come see how you're doing." It wasn't his father, but it was someone who cared. And in that moment, that was enough. However, for Frank, the nightmare wasn't over. Not long after, Frank was prepped for another major surgery. They were implanting stainless steel rods for spinal support. The surgery started in the early afternoon and didn't end until well past 9 p.m. When he woke up in recovery, the anesthesia had worn off. Then, the pain hit. It was unlike anything he had ever felt in his life. It felt like someone had taken a brick and shoved it into his spine. He screamed. And screamed. And screamed the whole night long. They couldn't give him pain medication for 8 more hours. Frank didn't care who else was in the recovery room. He didn't care about anything. He just needed the pain to stop. He begged. He pleaded. He wanted to die rather than endure another second of this agony. Then, the shift change. A new nurse walked in. She held out a Walkman. "Another patient wants you to borrow this," she said. "He just wants you to stop screaming." Frank was too exhausted to be offended. She placed the headphones over his ears. She asked, "Can we get you anything else to make you feel comfortable?" Frank nodded, and asked for a Coke. Then, the pain meds finally arrived. She handed him a Coke. Frank took a sip. And passed out. When he woke up again, he was back in his hospital room. Yet, his fight still wasn't over. But he had survived another day. The time had come for Frank to be transferred. The ambulance ride felt endless, though in reality, it was just a short trip to a trauma recovery hospital in San Mateo, California. Every bump in the road sent sharp pain through his broken body, a cruel reminder that this wasn't just a bad dream. This was real. When he arrived, a new doctor met him with a calm but firm demeanor. "You're going to be here for 6 months, the doctor said. "You need time to heal, time to recover, and time to learn how to live again." Frank barely heard him. 6 months? The words went in one ear and out the other. They meant nothing. Not compared to the one truth that was finally settling in like a storm cloud in his soul. He was never going to walk again. Depression crept into every corner of his mind, suffocating him. It wasn't just that he'd never walk, it was knowing he'd never train in Kung Fu again. That part of his life, the part that had been his discipline, his passion, his identity, had been ripped away from him, and there was no getting it back. Every night, he cried himself to sleep. The nurses saw it. They tried to help. One, a kind-hearted older Irish Catholic woman, would rub his back and pray with him. Her voice was soft, filled with warmth and faith, but Frank felt nothing. Others would come in, offering him something, anything, to make him more comfortable. He'd just look at them, tears in his eyes, and say, "A new back." But there were no miracles. No one was coming to save him. His mental strength, his warrior spirit, was fading fast. And then, one night, Frank gave up. He didn't want to live like this. Not in a wheelchair. Not as half the man he used to be. He'd rather be dead. The thought sat in his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. It wasn't an impulse, it was a decision. So, he reached for the hospital phone. Dialed Ray. The moment he heard his best friend's voice, it gave him a brief flicker of comfort. They talked for a bit, the usual banter, but Frank wasn't really there. Then, in a voice so broken it hardly sounded like his own, he asked, "You're my friend, right?" Ray's answer was immediate. "Of course, bro. You'd do anything for me, right?" "Yeah." Frank took a deep breath. "Bring me a gun. Please." The line went silent. Then, Ray's voice, sharp and full of anger and love all at once. "No." And then, the dial tone. Ray had hung up on him. Frank lay there, tears streaming down his face, his chest heaving with sobs. He couldn't believe Ray had just left him like that. But deep down, he knew. Ray had done the right thing. And in some way, maybe that was the first sign, the first spark of something changing inside him. When Frank opened his eyes the next morning, something was different. Something inside him had ignited, a raging fire he hadn't felt since before the accident. It wasn't just survival anymore. It wasn't just about making it through another day. It was about proving everyone wrong. Nothing was going to stop him from walking again. Not doctors. Not spinal cord injuries. Not fate. Not even God himself. The fight for his life had begun, for real this time. Defying fate. Frank's declaration was absolute. I'm going to walk again. Period. Anyone within earshot heard it. He didn't whisper it. He didn't say it with doubt. He proclaimed it. It didn't matter that the doctors had given their verdict. It didn't matter that medical professionals, people with years of training and experience, told him it was impossible. Frank wasn't listening. His determination was so unyielding that the hospital staff began bringing in others, men who had already accepted their fate in wheelchairs, to try and convince him to do the same. But Frank wasn't having it. Each time, he met them with the same response. No. I am not going to be stuck in a wheelchair. No. He sent them all away, not out of disrespect, but because he refused to let their words plant seeds of doubt in his mind. He appreciated what they were trying to do, but he couldn't afford to let their reality become his reality. Still, with each passing day, and each silent, motionless moment in his legs, the darkness inside him grew. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was it. Until one day, a thought cut through the despair like a blade. The mind controls the body. Frank had trained in Kung Fu for years, and one of the core principles of his discipline was that the mind is stronger than the body. If he could train his muscles through mental focus in martial arts, why couldn't he do the same for his legs? He closed his eyes. Focused. And in his mind, he envisioned his legs moving. He pictured them lifting, bending, responding to his will. He repeated the process over and over and over again. Day in, day out. At first, nothing happened. Then, one day, as he lay in bed, something shifted. A flicker. A twitch in his left leg. His eyes widened. He tried again. It moved, again. His left leg had come back to life. The right leg remained stubbornly unresponsive, but this was proof. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't delusional. His mind was waking his body up again. The holidays were approaching, and the world outside continued as if nothing had changed. People were shopping, celebrating, living. And Frank was trapped in a hospital bed, watching the world move on without him. I'm going home by Christmas, he told the nurses. No matter what. They smiled politely but didn't argue. They had seen too many patients make promises like that, promises their bodies couldn't keep. But Frank wasn't like other patients. Christmas arrived, and though he wasn't home, the nurses did their best to make it special. They brought him gifts. They allowed him to use the mock apartment in the hospital to have friends and family over for a Christmas gathering. His DJ crew, second to none, showed up in full force, a room filled with love, laughter, and music. And then, it happened. Right in the middle of their celebration, Frank's right leg jerked to life. Everyone froze. Eyes widened. Did they just see that? Frank looked down, his heart racing. He tried again. His right leg moved. The room exploded with cheers. His crew, his family, witnessed it with their own eyes. Frank was coming back. He called the nurses down immediately to show them. They observed as he moved his leg, ever so slightly, but undeniably. And then, he declared his next challenge. Give me 1 week. I'll have this leg pulled up in a bent position. And with relentless dedication, morning, noon, and night, he worked at it. And then, one night, it happened. He pulled his right leg all the way back. The war had just turned in his favor. A fight in front of everyone. Frank's next goal was walking. It consumed his thoughts. When can I try? What about today? Tomorrow? Please, let me try. But after a month of lying flat on his back, his body wasn't ready. He had to be reintroduced to standing, a slow, painful process. But then, the day finally came. The parallel bars. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. His therapist sat beside him as he positioned himself in front of the bars. Then, a whisper. Another therapist leaned over and muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Don't get his hopes up. He's not going to walk. Frank's blood boiled. His rage was instant and volcanic. Who the hell were they to say that? His therapist saw the fire in Frank's eyes. He leaned in. You ready for this? Frank locked eyes with him. Yes. The entire room fell silent. Doctors, nurses, therapists, patients. All eyes were on Frank. He gripped the bars, pulled himself up. Every muscle in his upper body screamed, but he didn't let go. If he did, he'd hit the ground like dead weight. He focused on his legs. This was the moment. Then, a step. The room gasped. Then, another. And then, a third. Tears welled up in the eyes of everyone watching. Because they had already written the ending to Frank's story. But he had just rewritten it. The legend of the hospital. From that moment, Frank became the talk of the hospital. He went from a wheelchair, to a walker, to 2 crutches, to 2 canes. He'd walk into the dining room, and whispers would follow him. At first, it annoyed him, until he asked someone what they were saying. They smiled. Look at you. You started in a wheelchair, never supposed to walk again, and now you're walking into this dining room. We're all proud of you. Frank's heart swelled. Freedom. Then, the day came. His doctor entered his room and asked his family to step outside. Once they were alone, the doctor turned to Frank. Stand up and shake my hand, he said. Frank did. The doctor gripped his hand tightly and said something that would stay with him forever. Thank you for turning me into a liar. Frank had done the impossible. As he prepared to leave, one of his favorite nurses insisted on being the one to wheel him to the car. She wanted to see it with her own eyes. As he stood up from the wheelchair and got into the car, she smiled through tears. And as he drove away, they waved goodbye to each other. Frank had won. It wasn't Christmas. But less than 3 weeks later, he was home. No easy way out. The moment Frank was discharged from the hospital, he refused to waste a single second. He had lost enough time lying in that bed, watching life go on without him. So that very Monday, just 2 days after getting out, he went back to school. He wasn't about to sit at home feeling sorry for himself. His brother from another mother, Alan, made sure of that. Every morning, without fail, Alan would roll up in his Monte Carlo, load Frank's wheelchair into the back, and drive them to school. The moment Frank rolled through the doors, his classmates surrounded him. They were shocked, inspired, relieved. Frank had survived something that should have ended him. Now, he was back. And his friends? They were fighting over who got to push him around the hallways. For the first time in a long time, Frank felt normal again. The 3 words that changed everything. One morning, Alan didn't show up. Frank waited. No car. No call. Nothing. His chest tightened. He wanted to go to school. He needed to go. When the school day ended, Frank called him up, furious. Yo. What happened? Why didn't you pick me up? Alan's response was cold. Direct. Take the bus. Frank's blood boiled. Take the bus? How the hell was he supposed to take the bus when he could barely walk? His legs were weak. Every step felt like a war. Alan was supposed to be his brother. His ride. Instead, he just left him hanging. But Frank wasn't about to sit around and sulk. If Alan wasn't picking him up, then fine. He'd get to school himself. A hard lesson in strength. The next morning, Frank took the bus. It was a struggle just to get to the stop. Then, when he got off, he realized just how far he had to walk. It was agony. Every step felt like it took 5 seconds. By the time he reached the school, he was exhausted. And pissed. Pissed at Alan. Pissed at his legs. Pissed at the universe. But he kept going. And every single day, as he limped, struggled, and fought his way from the bus stop to school, he cursed Alan's name the whole way. Frank didn't understand it at the time. It felt like betrayal. Like Alan had abandoned him. But he wasn't about to quit. No way. No how. Understanding too late. Years later, Frank finally realized the truth. Alan hadn't done him dirty. Alan hadn't abandoned him. Alan was teaching him. He was forcing Frank to walk. To push himself. To not take the easy way out. And though Frank had hated him for it back then, he loved and respected him for it now. Because Alan had helped him get to where he was today. Alan is gone now, but his lesson lived on. And every step Frank took was because of him. Mind over matter. The years following Frank's release from the hospital were dedicated to recovery and regaining a sense of normalcy in his life. For a long time, he stayed away from the Tianlong Kung Fu Club, believing that his Sifu had retired and that chapter of his life was over. Instead, he focused on rebuilding his body and practicing what he had already learned, determined to reclaim as much of his old self as possible. Then, one day, while attending San Francisco City College, he ran into a former Kung Fu classmate who would change everything. Sifu is still teaching, his classmate told him. You should go visit him. The news shocked Frank. His teacher had not retired after all. That same day, he decided to find out for himself. Returning to his roots. Walking down the street on two canes, Frank finally saw his Sifu, Master Dino Salvaterra, step outside. At first, his teacher barely noticed him. But as Frank got closer, recognition washed over his face. Until that moment, Sifu had no idea what had happened to his former student. Frank followed him inside, where they sat and talked about everything: the accident, the recovery, the fight to regain his strength. After listening intently, Sifu made a decision. He would personally help Frank take his recovery even further. That day, Frank officially returned to his training. No canes. No excuses. There was only one condition. Sifu told Frank that if he wanted to continue, he had to put his canes to the side and stand in a proper horse stance. Frank hesitated. His legs were weak. His balance was unstable. And deep down, he was afraid of falling. But he refused to back down. The struggle was real. Even Frank's physical therapist had questioned how he could walk into rehab but struggle with simple exercises. The answer was simple. Willpower. And that willpower kept him pushing forward. Day after day. Week after week. Month after month. Year after year. His body fought against him, but his mind refused to surrender. Competing against the odds. As Frank's strength improved, he eventually began performing again. Then, he took the next step, competing in martial arts tournaments. Physically, he knew he wasn't ready. But his heart, mind, and spirit told him otherwise. His first competitions were tough. He lost more than he won. But quitting was never an option. Each loss only fueled his fire. And then, one day, he won. And after that, he kept winning. An unexpected honor. As time went on, Frank found purpose in teaching. He worked with Sifu's new students, guiding them as they learned, helping wherever he could. Becoming a teacher had never been his goal. He just wanted to give back to the place that had always felt like home. Then, one day, Sifu did something that Frank never expected. He promoted him to the Sifu level. After everything, surviving the accident, defying the odds, proving everyone wrong, Frank had earned the title of a master. The honor meant everything to him. Inspiring the next fighter. One evening, Frank was leaving a restaurant with his second-to-none family when he spotted a man walking in on crutches. Something about him seemed familiar. Then it hit him. It was his former hospital roommate. Frank remembered his story. He had fallen down a flight of stairs, severing his spinal cord in 7 places. Doctors had told him he would never walk again. Yet there he was, on his feet. Frank smiled, walked over, and said, "Look at you. You're walking." His former roommate sat down, looked up at Frank, and said something that would stay with him forever. "It's because of you. You said you could do it, and you did. So I knew I could do it too." And he did. Mind over matter, baby. That moment made Frank realize something profound. His journey wasn't just about him. It was about every single person who needed to see that no matter how dark things get, no matter how impossible the road may seem, the fight is never over. This is where Frank chooses to end his story. But his message to anyone going through their own battle? Mind over matter, baby. Never give up.